Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
Here's to the only one who actually did something with their life, my mother said, her voice soaked in the smug, syrupy sweetness of pride, the kind that never touched me, never reached my side of the table. Never once glanced in my direction, even out of polite obligation. She raised her glass, one of those heavy crystal things she only dragged out for what she called proper celebrations, and aimed her gaze straight at Daniel, her darling son. The golden boy who could have probably admitted to murder and still had her smiling over a roast with gravy. Daniel, dressed in a navy suit he probably had dry cleaned specifically for tonight, flashed his polished, media-trained smile and gave that sheepish chuckle he always pulled out when he was pretending to be humble. And, just like that, the rest of the table, his wife, my Uncle Gary, Mom's neighbor Connie, even the damn waiter who brought the champagne laughed and nodded along as if God himself had signed off on the sentiment. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, my fingers brushing the linen napkin in my lap, tracing the seams like they could somehow stitch together the thick knot in my chest. It wasn't new. That feeling. That hollow, tight silence inside me. It had been there for years, decades even. Like wallpaper in a childhood bedroom you never really liked, but got used to. It was familiar. Uncomfortable, but familiar. And it only ever flared up at times like this, when my existence was politely overlooked, like I'd been invited out of guilt and kept in the frame out of pity. You'd think after all this time I'd be numb to it, immune to the sting of being the background character in someone else's celebration. But no. Somehow, it still hurt, just a little differently now. Not like a cut anymore, but like an old bruise someone kept pressing on. They talked about Daniel's award, a state-level recognition for his medical research, some grant, or maybe a public health campaign. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. The specifics changed, but the story stayed the same. Daniel, the savior, the achiever, the son who gave his mother something to brag about to the bridge club. Diane Foster's pride and joy. And me? I was Rachel. The other one. The daughter who had potential once, who used to write those cute little poems, who probably would have done something big, if only she'd stuck with it. That's what they used to say, back when I still bothered showing up to things like Easter brunch or Christmas Eve dinners. But those days were gone. These days, they didn't say much at all. I looked across the table, taking in the picture-perfect moment. Daniel clinked his glass against Mom's, gave a half-hearted, thanks, Ma, and made a joke about how he only got the award because the real winner got food poisoning. Everybody laughed. I smiled too, but it wasn't real. It was that same expression you wear at the DMV when they tell you to smile for your license. Functional. Empty. But inside, something was shifting. Not exploding, just slowly, methodically breaking apart, like ice cracking under weight. I'd waited long enough. Played nice long enough. Swallowed things no grown woman should ever have to. And tonight, of all nights, I decided I wouldn't leave quietly. Not this time. I cleared my throat, a small sound that somehow felt louder than the silverware. Nobody noticed. Not at first. Daniel was still basking, and Mom was still going on about how proud Dad would have been if you were still around. God rest his soul. That line always got her misty-eyed, even though we both knew Dad had died with more regret in his eyes than pride. I think he knew, deep down, that he'd let something rot in our family, something unspoken, but heavy. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, worn, corduroy, nothing fancy, and felt the folded edge of the envelope I'd tucked there that morning. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. I just let my hand rest on it, grounding myself, reminding myself that it was real, that it existed, that I wasn't crazy for carrying it around for this exact moment. I didn't come to celebrate. I came to remember why I stayed quiet for so long and why that silence was about to end. The envelope wasn't flashy. White. Unmarked. Plain. But its contents had teeth. Years of teeth. Carefully filed. Legally notarized. And with the kind of weight that could snap the spine of a story that had been building for too damn long. I let my hand drop back to my lap. There would be time. A perfect time. Because I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I didn't want to scream or accuse or stand up on a chair and ruin everyone's dinner. No. I wanted a scalpel, not a hammer. Something clean, sharp, memorable. And I knew how to wait. God, did I know how to wait. So, Rachel, Connie asked me with her too red lipstick and her nervous energy, what VE you been up to these days? Still working at that little bookstore. I smiled again. Still there. I didn't tell her about the other job. The one I started 6 years ago. The one that paid more than Daniel's practice made in a year. I didn't tell her about the consulting or the fact that I'd written policy drafts for a senator under an NDA, or that the last project I'd touched saved 100,000 low-income families from eviction during the pandemic. No, I didn't tell her any of that. Because they didn't want that, Rachel. They never did. Must be nice, you know, Connie added, sipping her rose, keeping it simple. Not everyone needs to conquer the world. I nodded politely, though I felt my knuckles tighten around my fork. Then I looked across the table again, saw Daniel holding court, saw my mother beaming like he'd just cured cancer and resurrected Jesus at the same time. That's when I knew. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was done. They didn't know the version of me that mattered. But they were about to meet her. And I was going to make damn sure no one forgot. Because that letter in my pocket? It wasn't a bomb. It was justice. Written in black ink. And it had my name all over it. It's strange, the things that stay with you, not the milestones, not the grand declarations or disasters, but the quiet, ordinary moments that no one else noticed. The ones that made you swallow a lump in your throat so early in life you didn't even know how to name it yet. I remember one Christmas, maybe I was 10, maybe 11, when Daniel opened a gift from our father, a silver watch with his initials engraved on the back. And Mom clapped her hands together like she'd just seen the second coming right there under our fake pine tree. Daniel, grinning like he'd won the lottery, leaned over to thank Dad, who gave him that slow, rare smile of approval. And me? I was sitting 2 feet away, holding a box set of children's cookbooks that were clearly on clearance, the kind of thing you give a niece you don't know very well. I said thank you, too, and Mom told me I should learn to be more enthusiastic. That was the whole scene. It didn't end in a fight. No one cried. But something inside me got very still that day, and it stayed that way for a long, long time. The thing about being compared to someone who fits the mold is that eventually, you stop trying to break it, you just learn to live around it, bending yourself into quieter shapes, ones that don't bother anyone or take up too much space at the table. That's what I did. I became the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the one who didn't argue at the dinner table or roll her eyes when Daniel told stories that made him the hero and everyone else the grateful witness. He got trophies, and I got told to be nicer. He got to fail upward, and I got lectured for getting a B in calculus. He drank beer in high school, crashed Dad's Buick into a mailbox, and still got into Duke because Dad pulled strings at the alumni office. I got into a solid state university on merit, took out student loans, worked part-time at a used bookstore, and was told I needed to aim higher. Funny how ambition looks different depending on who's holding the measuring stick. After Dad passed quietly in the middle of the night, with no dramatic gestures or last words, just a long sigh and a stillness that blanketed the house, I stayed. Daniel flew in from Chicago, arrived 36 hours late with a suitcase and a speech, made it known he wished he'd had more time, and then left after 2 days, citing work. And I stayed. I dealt with the hospice paperwork, the estate attorney, the refrigerator full of expired yogurts, and the smell of dying that lingered in the guest room for months. Mom never said thank you. She barely looked at me. She just kept asking what time Daniel's flight landed and whether he'd remembered to bring the family photo albums back from storage. That was the rhythm of my life. Him, with the spotlight. Me, backstage, cleaning up the confetti after the show. There were things I wanted, of course. I wasn't some saintly martyr sweeping floors in silence. I wanted to leave. I wanted to take a job offer I got in New York at a nonprofit that needed analysts with policy backgrounds. I wanted to marry someone other than Jerry, who was safe and dull and eventually resentful in that quiet way men get when you're not their fantasy, but you're good enough to look good next to. But I didn't. Because there was something else happening behind the scenes that nobody ever asked me about, maybe because they assumed I had nothing better going on. The truth is, Dad and I had one of those relationships that existed entirely outside Mom's line of sight. We weren't affectionate, we didn't hug much or say, "I love you," but we talked. Not often. Not dramatically. But meaningfully. And toward the end, when his voice had grown weak and his hands trembled when he lifted a coffee cup, he said something to me I never forgot. "You see things. Not like your brother. You actually look." I don't think he meant it to be profound. But it was the first time anyone in that house had acknowledged that I wasn't just Daniel's shadow. And then, there was the day I found out about the letter. It wasn't a discovery, not in the dramatic sense. There was no secret envelope hidden behind a painting or a dramatic posthumous revelation. It was handed to me quietly by Mr. Linwood, Dad's longtime attorney, a man who smelled like paper and patience and always carried 2 handkerchiefs, one for show, one for use. We met at a small cafe near the courthouse 3 weeks after the funeral, and he slid the envelope across the table like it was just another receipt. "Your father left you this," he said. "Said to give it to you personally. No mail. No phone calls." I took it without opening it, not because I wasn't curious, but because I already knew, deep down, that whatever was inside would be the kind of truth you can't unknow. I didn't open it for a week. What I found inside wasn't money or a final confession. It was a set of instructions, specific, measured, and completely unexpected. It was also a legal document that stated, in precise language, that the remaining family estate, small as it was, would belong to me, not Daniel, and that Dad had set up a private fund years ago to help cover Daniel's tuition and future debt. A fund I had unknowingly contributed to by giving up job opportunities to stay close. The biggest surprise? A short, handwritten note tucked into the back of the envelope, just 4 lines long. "Don't wait forever, Rachel. I know you stayed. I know why. When the time comes, say what needs to be said." That was it. That was the entire inheritance, really, not the house, not the bank account, not the dusty jewelry in Mom's drawer, but those words, handed down like a torch. I put the letter away. Told no one. Not even Jerry. Not even myself on some days. I buried it like a seed and waited, even though I didn't know exactly what I was waiting for. Until tonight. Because this wasn't about proving I was better. This wasn't about finally being noticed. This was about balance. About holding up a mirror to a story that had only ever been told from one side. And maybe, just maybe, about telling the truth out loud before it curdled into something uglier. I reached into my jacket pocket under the table and let my fingers brush the edge of the envelope again. The weight of it hadn't changed. But I had. Some people wear masks their whole lives and get so good at it, so practiced in every twitch of the mouth and flicker of the eyes, that eventually even the people closest to them forget to ask what's underneath. Daniel wasn't just good at the act, he was born into it. Raised in a house where his bare minimum was always praised like excellence, and where any crack in the surface could be paved over with charm, credentials, or the simple, unstoppable force of our mother's blind adoration. He learned early that you didn't need to be honest to be admired, you just needed to look the part, speak in calm, measured tones, and occasionally throw in a self-deprecating joke to remind everyone you were still grounded, even while standing on a mountain of unearned approval. What Daniel doesn't know, what he never knew, was that while he played the role of the prodigal son with flawless conviction, I was watching from the wings, collecting the moments that didn't make it into the family scrapbook. The moments he was sure no one noticed because, frankly, no one ever had before. But I noticed. I remembered. I filed away every careless comment, every glimpse behind the curtain, every hollow smile that didn't quite reach his eyes when no one was watching. I learned to watch him the way you study a magician, not dazzled, but skeptical, waiting for the sleight of hand. It started with small things. Nothing criminal, nothing that would make headlines, just glimpses of who he really was when the audience stepped out of the room. Like the time I visited him in Chicago years ago, when we were both in our early 30s. Mom had begged me to go, said Daniel was under a lot of pressure, that he'd love the company, though I knew he hadn't asked me to come. Still, I flew out, stayed in his apartment, and within 24 hours, I saw what the cracks looked like up close. He treated his wife like an accessory, barely acknowledged the housekeeper, and made offhand comments about how some people just don't have the drive to succeed, right after I'd told him I'd taken a break from work to care for Dad during chemo. That night, after 2 glasses of wine and a few compliments he didn't mean, he bragged about how he'd inflated his research numbers to secure a hospital grant. "Everyone does it. Ratch, come on," he said with that infuriating grin, and when I didn't laugh, he waved it off like I was being dramatic, like morality was some luxury I couldn't afford to pretend I had. But it wasn't just ego, not really. It was entitlement. The kind that seeps into your bones when you've spent a lifetime being told you're special. And what scared me most wasn't what he did, it was how completely certain he was that it didn't matter. There were bigger things too over time. Slips that weren't just off-color comments or arrogant smirks. A few years ago, a rumor circulated that a major funding error had nearly cost his clinic a lawsuit. The papers said it was a clerical error. Daniel said it was sabotage. But I knew, because I had seen the way he moved funds around before, using non-profit dollars to furnish his office with imported furniture and charge business dinners at steakhouses that cost more than my rent. I had the receipts, literal, not metaphorical. I found them in a pile of papers he left at Mom's house during one visit, because he never assumed anyone would bother reading through them. But I did. I sat up one night, sleepless and bitter, reading through every line of a quarterly report he discarded like it was nothing, and I saw the numbers didn't match. He was embezzling in a way so subtle it wouldn't catch the eye of anyone who wasn't looking for it. But I didn't say anything. Not then. Not yet. And the truth is, I don't think I stayed silent because I was scared of him, or even because I didn't think anyone would believe me. I stayed silent because I knew the truth wouldn't land the way it should. If I had brought it to our mother, she would have brushed it off as jealousy. If I had taken it public, it would have been spun into a story about a bitter sister with a chip on her shoulder. I didn't want to win a battle only to lose the war. I didn't want vindication if it came at the price of being seen as vindictive. So I waited. And in the meantime, I watched Daniel dig his own grave, one smug little shovelful at a time. I watched as he coasted on the myth of his brilliance, as he gathered awards and praise and nods from people who didn't know any better. And I kept everything. The receipts. The notes. The letter from Dad. The moment he told me, half drunk at Thanksgiving, that he only stayed married for the tax benefits. Every puzzle piece. Because Daniel doesn't know that the biggest mistake he ever made wasn't in how he manipulated his finances or treated people like tools. It was assuming that I wasn't paying attention. That I was still the girl in the corner with nothing to say and no ambition beyond reading books and keeping the peace. He never saw that I was the one person in his life with absolutely no interest in being impressed by him. And what he really doesn't know, what's going to blindside him when the time comes, is that the only reason I never exposed him was because I had something better than proof. I had patience. I had timing. And I had nothing left to lose. What Daniel doesn't know is that the letter I've carried for years isn't just a document, it's a detonator, and I've been holding it with the calm, practiced hand of someone who's had more time than she ever wanted to think about when and how to finally light the match. And he won't see it coming. Not until it's far too late. There is a specific kind of silence that descends upon a room when the social rules everyone has silently agreed to follow are shattered, a dense, suffocating stillness that falls not out of peace, but out of pure disbelief. And as I stood from my seat at the dinner table, my hand wrapped tightly around the now slightly wrinkled envelope I had kept hidden inside my jacket for years longer than anyone would believe, I could feel that silence crawling in, slow and deliberate, filling the spaces between the clinking glasses and the polite laughter like a fog that no one saw coming. My mother, mid-sentence, was still smiling, her lips forming the final syllables of a familiar toast about legacy and achievement, about how Daniel had always made her proud, and how some people are just born with something special, and the rest of the table, like trained musicians in a string quartet, nodded and chuckled right on cue. But I no longer cared about staying in rhythm, and when I pushed my chair back, the sound of the legs dragging across the hardwood felt louder than anything anyone had said all evening. I didn't speak right away, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be deliberate, because every second I waited stretched the moment a little thinner, pulled it tighter, gave it tension. And then I said it, my voice clear, even, maybe a touch too calm. Funny, I said, letting the word hang like a match above gasoline, because this says otherwise. I laid the envelope down next to my mother's plate, carefully, not with force or drama, but with finality, as though I were returning something borrowed and long overdue. Diane Foster, my mother, the matriarch of appearances and proud delusions, looked down at the envelope like it had materialized from thin air, her brow furrowing, her expression shifting, just slightly, from one of superiority to cautious confusion. Daniel, still chewing on his third glass of wine and the residue of praise, tilted his head as if trying to determine whether this was some sort of joke, some bitter little outburst meant to disrupt his evening of self-congratulation. No one spoke. No one dared. And that, more than anything, told me the timing was perfect. I told them they could open it, that I had nothing to hide, and yet I still felt the room resisting, as if the entire family system had been trained over years not to question the hierarchy, not to ask questions that might require uncomfortable answers. So I opened it for them. I reached into the envelope and withdrew the folded pages, some typed, some handwritten, all of them legal and final and, most importantly, undeniable. I started with the document from Mr. Linwood, the family lawyer who had known my father since before Daniel and I were born. A man who had carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew how to keep other people's secrets, but also when to reveal them. The letter explained, in clear and clinical language, that my father's estate, the modest savings, the paid-off home, the residual rights to a set of medical patents he had worked on as a young man, all of it had been left to me. Not to Daniel. Not to both of us. Just me. And if the room was still before, it was frozen now. I explained, not angrily, not bitterly, but with something closer to weariness, that years ago, while everyone believed Daniel had paid his way through medical school with scholarships and hard work, our father had quietly set up a fund to cover the full cost after Daniel had lost his scholarship due to an academic misconduct claim that never made it past internal review. The family never knew because I didn't tell them. I didn't tell them that the money that filled the gap in that fund had partially come from selling the New York job opportunity one once had, from liquidating the severance and moving back home. I didn't tell them because I thought it didn't matter, because I believed, at the time, that keeping peace was more important than credit, more important than truth. But peace is only noble when it's mutual. Then I read them the note, the handwritten message from my father, scrawled in his familiar, slanted handwriting, the one I used to mimic as a child when I forged sick notes in middle school just to stay home and read library books. Rachel, it read, you were the only one who showed up, who didn't ask what was in it for you. You gave without asking, stayed without being asked, and kept this family whole when I couldn't. This is for you, not to reward you, but to make something right. I watched my mother as I read. Watched her lips tighten and her eyes harden, watched the color drain not because she was ashamed, but because the foundation she'd built her entire identity on, this idea that Daniel was the family's anchor and I was some half-floating regret, had just cracked, and she didn't know how to patch it. She started to interrupt, to say something about how I'd misunderstood, how Dad had always been sentimental and didn't mean to cause division. But I cut her off. No, Mom, I said, steady and clear. He meant every word. And you would have seen that if you ever looked past the person you wanted me to be. Daniel, silent until now, finally found his voice, and it came out sharp, clipped, defensive. He accused me of forging it, of manipulating Dad while he was sick, of playing the victim to gain control. But the desperation in his voice betrayed him. He wasn't shocked by the facts, he was shocked that I had the courage to say them out loud. And that's what made him dangerous. But I didn't flinch. I told him I had copies filed, notarized, time-stamped. I told him Mr. Linwood had passed last week, and with him went the last buffer between this truth and the public. I told him the paper trail was secure, and if he wanted to go to court, I welcomed the opportunity. Because for once in his life, Daniel was going to face a fight he couldn't charm his way out of. And then I sat down. That was it. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat, letting the letter sit on the table like a bomb that had already gone off. Because the truth, once spoken, doesn't need to be shouted to echo. It just needs to be real. And after a lifetime of being told I was the one who hadn't done anything with her life, I had finally done the only thing that mattered. I'd told the truth. And no one at that table would ever forget it. There is an eerie kind of calm that settles after a storm, a quiet so thick it feels like the air itself has stopped moving, like the world knows something irreversible has just taken place, but hasn't quite figured out how to process it yet. That's what the room felt like when I sat back down at the dinner table, the letter resting where I'd left it like a funeral program no one had asked to read, its presence now undeniable. Its words already beginning to unravel the carefully curated myth that had defined our family for so long. No one spoke, not at first, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't feel hollow, desperate, or dangerously close to admitting the truth they'd all chosen to ignore for decades. My mother stared at the letter as if by sheer force of will she could make it disappear, as if she could unsee the handwriting she knew as intimately as her own, deny the legal seals, or rewrite the details that had finally shattered the story she had spent most of her adult life believing and repeating. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, and for a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her, not because of the wrinkles or the thinning hair, but because something in her had been cracked, not just her pride, but her certainty, that righteous, unyielding belief that she had always known best, always seen most clearly. And now, with a few sheets of paper and a calm voice, I had taken that certainty from her, and I hadn't done it out of cruelty. I had done it because it was long past time for someone to tell the truth. Daniel, meanwhile, had gone silent in a different way. His hands were clenched into fists against the polished surface of the table, his expression no longer arrogant or amused, but tight with calculation, the way a man looks when he realizes he has just lost a war he didn't know he was fighting. His jaw was set, and behind his eyes I could see the wheels turning, not toward reflection or regret, but strategy, damage control, the kind of mental scrambling that happens when the mask slips and the man behind it has no script. He didn't deny the contents of the letter, not anymore, because even he knew that denial would only make him look smaller. But he also didn't apologize, because men like Daniel don't apologize unless they're cornered, and even then, it's rarely because they feel sorry, it's because they need to survive. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice low, bitter, as if he were accusing me of setting a trap instead of simply telling the truth. "You waited until Mom was surrounded, until I had something to lose. You wanted to humiliate us." I looked at him then, not with rage or triumph, but with a kind of tired honesty that came from carrying the weight of being underestimated for far too long. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I waited because I wanted to see if it would ever occur to either of you to ask, to notice, to remember." My mother flinched at that, not visibly, but something in her eyes flickered, and I wondered if she finally heard what I'd been silently screaming for most of my life. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms like she was bracing against a cold wind, and said, with a voice so tight it sounded like it was straining not to tremble, "Your father never told me any of this." I nodded slowly. "I know. Because he didn't trust you to understand it." Her mouth dropped open at that, not from the insult itself, but from the realization that she couldn't argue it without proving it true. And then the moment passed, as it always does, not with an explosion, but with the slow sinking weight of inevitability. The rest of the evening unraveled quietly. The celebratory champagne remained untouched. The waiter, who had sensed the shift and wisely retreated, never returned with dessert. No one dared to toast again. My mother didn't look at me for the rest of the night, and Daniel left first, his face stiff with restrained fury, his footsteps sharp and fast like someone retreating from a battlefield. And when the front door finally closed behind them, I remained at the table for a long time, listening to the ticking of the antique clock on the wall and the dull hum of a refrigerator that, for some reason, sounded louder than it ever had before. I thought I might feel victorious, might feel lighter or vindicated or even relieved, but what I felt was quieter, more complicated, something closer to release than triumph, not because I had burned bridges, but because I had finally stopped pretending they were ever whole to begin with. The lie had been exposed, but the cost of carrying it all those years could not be refunded. I got into my car that night with the envelope tucked back into my bag, not because I needed to keep it anymore, but because I hadn't yet decided where to leave it. And as I drove home, past the dim-lit streets of the neighborhood where I had grown up, past the old grocery store with the flickering sign, past the park where Daniel and I had once played catch under our father's watchful eye, I realized how little of that world remained untouched by the truth I had finally spoken. Later that week, Diane called once. Just once. She didn't leave a voicemail, and I didn't call back. I knew what that silence meant. It wasn't peace. It was retreat. Daniel, on the other hand, tried harder. He sent an email, short, clipped, lawyerly in tone, claiming he intended to challenge the estate documents, that there may have been undue influence or mental decline involved in my father's decisions. I forwarded the message to my own attorney without response. A week later, I found out he'd withdrawn the threat after learning that the records had already been submitted to the probate court, clean and unassailable. There was nothing left for him to do but stew in the wreckage of his own entitlement. What no one knew, what they still don't know, is that I never touched the money. Not a single cent. Instead, I transferred the entire sum into a private charitable trust I'd set up under a different name, and every dollar is now supporting a women's shelter in our city, one that had nearly closed during the last recession, one that saved a woman I once knew, back when I worked quietly in the margins of public policy while Daniel took headlines. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because it was the only thing that ever made sense to do with the truth once I'd earned the right to speak it out loud. And in the end, that's what this story is, not about revenge, not about justice or even fairness, because those words feel too small, too clean for what happened. It's about weight. About the unbearable, invisible weight of being told your entire life that you're invisible, only to discover you were holding all the power all along, but had been convinced never to use it. Now, when people ask me what happened to my family, because yes, word did get out, and yes, people love a scandal, I just smile, slow and calm, and say, they told me I hadn't done anything with my life. And I let the silence that follows say everything else.